So I know how much you do enjoy a rousing philosophical discussion on how systems grow and develop and what the next way for human beings to manage power, moving from a power over paradigm to a power with paradigm. I know how much we all love that. And I changed the sermon topic because yet another moment of just great tragedy has struck us. And so it didn't feel like as pleasant of an escape that might be to just discuss something philosophical, didn't quite feel like the moment for that. That subject, though, is very much involved in what we're seeing in the world, so it will creep in. But today, our subject is mourning and empowerment. So I wanted to address a need that was spoken to me, a number of our members, as well as just people in the community at large, expressed that in the face of another tragedy, just hot on the heels of a tragedy right before it, both involving firearms, they just didn't know what to do, right? Like, have you experienced this? You're like, gosh, do I load the dishwasher or do I not load the dishwasher? I can stuff my feelings down and get everything done, or I can collapse and maybe not be of service to myself or others. And which one am I going to be capable of? And which one feels right? Which one feels like it honors this moment? And I think that's a pretty tough question that for me, I know it's been facing us, especially for the last 6 years or so, of hate upon hate upon hate and tragedy upon tragedy. You know, we had tragedies before, but I don't think they were quite as normalized in the spotlight as they are in this moment right now. And it takes a toll on the human spirit. What I wanted to address is what I think we all intuit, that it feels like we have two bad choices. We have the choice of being in complete overwhelm, like, some members of our congregation or our friends may have felt on the night of that Trump election and for a few weeks afterwards, just being in overwhelm and not being able to function. And then something happens when the litany of horrors just continues, that we're in danger of becoming benumbed to it. And we're trying to figure out, how do you go on and be an engaged person who might be overwhelmed at the drop of a hat, and yet how do you do that without becoming numb to the new normal? And this is, I'm not really great at leading mourning circles, as some of my New Age friends, might call them or something. That's not really my strong suit, but I do know about how our brains work. And it's something we need to be aware of, I think, if we are going to be of best service, that our human brains want to find what the new normal is so that we can adapt to it. And at the same time, these are things that we should not adapt to. We should not start feeling that this is just how it is now and let our brains shift into, well, I guess, we're just going to go down and pump some expensive gas while Ukraine and while Buffalo and while Texas and while thoughts and prayers and while the Supreme Court. And so we're in this position where if I just list those things off, I start to feel like Atlas, holding, he said the Supreme Court. And yet if we don't list those off in our minds, we're more likely to become accustomed to things that we should not become accustomed to. And so that's what I hear in that question. One of the people I heard ask it is a mother. One of the people I heard ask it is a high school student. That how do we How should we feel? How do I carry myself in a world like this? We want to have an open heart, and yet we also want to function. And I think we need some special skills if we're going to be able to have both of those. So I wanted to give you a little talk, the first section called How to Find Resource in Terrible Times. How to find resource in terrible times. The first thing we need to understand is about secondary trauma. Have you heard of this? Secondary trauma or reciprocal trauma? So right now, if you're on the internet at all or something like that, trauma is so hot right now because we are starting to understand the human neurology and physiology of how we recover from horrifying, destabilizing, or intense events, how we recover or how we don't recover. A lot of the world is becoming trauma informed, which is a very good thing. One of the things that is lesser known is that you don't have to have the trauma happen to you for it to impact your body mind. You just have to be aware of it. This is something that healthcare workers and psychotherapists and news reporters know very well as others of us. So I don't know about y'all, but I had a terrible day earlier this week when that news came out. And it wasn't just because of that news. That news was horrible enough, but by some twist of unlucky fate, I also started reading a book that I highly recommend called An Indigenous People's History of the United States. But if you read it, go back and listen to this first part of this sermon because you're gonna need some resourcing skills. I think we all know, this is a tangent, but just bear with me. I got to regulate my own nervous system, and tangents help with that a little bit. I think we all know that our nation is founded on genocide. That's the bedrock of our great achievements. But I don't think we think about the details of it. And chapter 1 of that book is all the details of it. And so on my little commute to the store, I'm studying up for my July 10th service on the secret truth behind the American Revolution. And then also the continuing foreground of violence that is our current nation's history. And I felt lucky I knew about secondary trauma. I felt grateful I knew about secondary trauma because even though I could not help the indigenous people of 500 years ago and 400 years ago and 200 years ago and 100 years ago and 10 years ago and right now, in that moment, and even though I couldn't be a first responder who did go into a school to protect others instead of just thinking about protecting myself, I could at least recognize that I had a moment where I could be collapsed by my system going into a fight or flight response about things that weren't in my direct environment, or I could have self-compassion and allow that to work through me so that the next day I would be able to think about actions that I can take on behalf of others. I think if we understand about secondary trauma, we'll understand why we'll tend to freeze. This is the question that I hear when people say, well, how should I feel? What should I do? Because we're trying so desperately not to let our system freeze. Freeze is the response when there's nowhere to run. And there's also, we don't exactly know how to fight. It's the last effort of a human system to at least, maybe the predator will go away. Or if that's not the case, I can disassociate enough that I'm not undergoing extra suffering for now. Unfortunately, this freeze response couples with some other responses in our brain, things like learned helplessness, things like negativity bias, and it can become something that erodes the hope that we so desperately need if we are to make the changes that will stop these tragedies from happening. So I wanted to share that with you today, a little notion that there comes a point where maybe we should ask, like, yeah, but is it okay to regulate my nervous system when others are suffering? You know, there's a, should I be overwhelmed? Well, no, how are you going to help? And yet we also don't want to become numb. We have to find a way to thread the needle to having our hearts open and feeling and mourning and enraged, and not so flooded by those feelings that we do become numb or disempowered or ill, so that we can't work for the betterment of others. We have to find a way for that. And good thing there's science. So we should stay disturbed, but at the same time, we cannot help anyone if we're in a state of overwhelm. We need the tools to mourn in a healthy way, never just moving on, but also being able to come back to the resource of the present moment and the good things in our lives, but to use those as resources so that we may help others. So I wanted to lead you in a practice I shared a couple weeks ago, which is the butterfly hug from the EMDR tradition. And I would like, if you don't mind, to do that together, because when we practice things like this together, it helps shift us out of the limbo state where we just don't know what to do, and into the state where instead of freeze, we can do something more productive, which is fight. So with that spirit of total aggression, let's make a little sweet butterfly. And all you're going to do, hopefully I won't hit this microphone too much, you're just going to tap one and the other, and you do this at whatever speed feels good to you. And something about this, we still don't quite know exactly what it is, but something about this in trauma recovery, they say it helps to shift your brain out of stuck loops. And as I do this, I notice myself wanting to take some sighs, which is a sign of your vagus nerve shifting from the one that wants to freeze into the one that wants to act. And then when it feels appropriate to you, you can let that motion come to pause. And let your hands just rest there. And imagine, now I'm going to say some new agey spiritual things, but they're evidence-based, so just play along. Imagine that some sacred force or divine force is pouring through your hands like a blessing into your body and into your heart. And you can think of any affirmations that feel good to you, like, may I be well and happy. May my family, community know peace. And if you have found these practices have brought a little calm to your body or mind, and just savor that state of calm for a moment. And especially the fact that we are practicing this way among friends. When you're ready, you can invite your mind to shift gears, keeping that relaxation with you, but coming back up toward the more conversational level of our being. So if we're able to come into the present moment, we are able to see clearly and act decisively. We can perhaps find a way through practices like this, or something that you know works for you, to get ourselves out of freeze mode and into action mode. Our second step then in mourning and empowerment, not contradictory, but mourning and empowerment together, is that we should then begin to titrate. This is an old alchemical term and now a chemical term, which is where you take two substances that if you mix them all together, they would explode, but you can drip a little bit in slowly by slowly, and they don't explode, and then you've mixed them together by the end. When we attempt to walk boldly into suffering through the power of our open hearts and our aspiration to help, we can sometimes be overwhelmed, flooded, and in danger of going numb. On the other hand, if we sit here and just do butterfly hugs for ourselves all day and make wishes and thoughts and prayers, it's unlikely we'll get off of our butts and actually be of service. We need to find a way to titrate these together so that we can have mourning and empowerment conjoined. If we wish to, we can learn a unique skill set of resilience, which is to be able to face great difficulties, even the profound ugliness of the world, from a place of groundedness and love. To do this, we may need to pendulate back and forth a little bit. We need to face some ugliness, and then you need to go and listen to a really good piece of music and get yourself back in your body right here with what you can get your hands on. We may need to look at what actions we can take. And when the overwhelming amount of action that needs to be taken threatens to overwhelm you, you pull out your novel and you disassociate for a little while. And eventually, by pendulating back and forth, we're also titrating these two seemingly opposite things of inner peace and the open-hearted compassion that can take in tragedy and take in horror. And we're learning to hold those at the same time so that we can be of greatest benefit. You may need to go and do some self-care until your tank is full. And if your self-care isn't filling your tank, we may need to find a different form of self-care or a different way to get in the fight that does work for our own unique situation. The third principle today in our talk on mourning and empowerment is action. We need to find a place where our power is and take action. This is really hard to do if we are threatened to go into freeze. Our action, you'll know that your nervous system hasn't come out of that secondary trauma because your actions will come in fits and starts. I'm not immune to that, but I know the science and I aspire toward it, so I'll share it with you. You'll go and get revved up and do something, and then we will collapse because it's hardly sustainable. Our system is working so hard to keep down the possibility of overwhelm. We only have so much energy to go and do concrete steps that may be of benefit. If we can get ourselves resourced in terrible times, we can take consistent action, small and steady, until we reach our goal. This is the narrow path between overwhelm on the one hand and numbness of the new normal on the other, and it comes from action. We have to know that we are not powerless. We must be real with our rage and fear and grief, but we can't let it make us lose hope. Hopelessness is a luxury. Instead, we must cultivate the active hope that comes from investing our spirits in what is ours to do. So the powerful news is that it is quite clear what stops gun violence. This is great news. We don't have to go and do all the research. That research is done. The data is in. The rhetoric from gun manufacturers is that more guns means safer people. And we have proven that false. We've been running an experiment here in the United States for the last few decades that has, well, let's put a ton of guns out there. Let's put more guns than any peer nation and see if it makes us safer. And it turns out that our American exceptionalism in this case is that we have more gun violence than any of those peer nations. The data is in. That experiment has been run. We don't need to replicate it anymore. The opposite of that experiment has been proven true in our peer nations, that fewer armed people actually leads to a safer society. How interesting. The second piece of powerful news is that fanatical gun rights groups, you've heard of them, right? They're just all over the news, like everywhere you turn. There's even if you're hearing the opposing opinion, you're hearing about fanatical gun rights groups and fanatical anti-abortion groups and fanatical anti-trans groups and other types of colonialism and misogyny and societally approved hatred. Good news is, this is a minority opinion. I think if you look at the news, even the news that's showing you the opposing opinion, you don't get the fact that this is a tiny, tiny group of zealots that has a really weird amount of power. It's a tiny, tiny group of zealots that has a really weird amount of power. 85% of Republicans support background checks on private gun sales. This is one of the ones that, like people like Cruz and Abbott and the other speakers at the bankrupt National Rifle Association convention, those folks, this is the thing they're against. Oh, you can't do that to our freedoms, our Second Amendment rights. 85% of their constituents are okay with closing that loophole, that the same rules that apply to licensed dealers also apply to private sales. That's low-hanging fruit. And there's a tiny, teeny, weeny group of extremely vocal zealots that have somehow managed to get our laws to be the opposite of the majority opinion. That just seems a little weird. A 2018 poll showed that 85% of registered voters in the US were in favor of some type of red flag laws. This is, if it seems like the person is likely to do violence, you don't let them buy a gun, right? Pretty simple. And 85% of registered voters, this was an exit poll from voting in 2018, are in favor of that type of law, right? And it's just a little bitty group of fanatics that have somehow got their hands on the levers of the lawmaking equipment that keep it from happening. How very interesting. In a 2020 poll, 70% of American voters felt that gun violence is an urgent issue. 70% of them. So if you go on the internet, and you type, hey, gun violence is a problem, and you get a bunch of comments from Russian bots that say, no, it's not. This is just a divide and conquer campaign run through social media. We've got an impression that there's this big, monolithic thing, this giant thing that's like wants us to be unsafe and wants to promote violence. And actually it's an itty little bit of backward thinking, primarily religious, colonialist, racists. Because most of the registered gun owners are in favor of more common sense gun regulation. People who have been exposed to guns in healthy ways want you to know how to lock the thing up. It's only people who, I don't exactly know what corners they're living in, think that there shouldn't be more education about how to secure your firearms. So there's very good news if you look at it from the right angle, right? The tragic news is that somehow the American populace, the registered voters of America, have let a tiny group of people be responsible for countless acts of terrorism in our own country, on our own children. That news is awful. And the good news is that a tiny group of people have somehow manipulated the laws in a way that promotes more violence. It's just a structural issue. And we have to think about what might happen if the majority learned how to flex their muscles properly to change the laws in a way that reflect what all of us actually think. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. So why don't we see change? Well, one opinion is it's because these minority opinions work their butts off to make sure it doesn't happen. One thing that is cool about us yo-yos is that we have this idea of a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Like, it's so epic. And that really fits for a lot of us because we don't want to proselytize others and we don't want to evangelize them. We don't want to say, hey, have you heard the good news about the interconnected web of life? Ah, there's evidence for it everywhere, all around us. Don't you want to get on board and interconnect with us? That makes us terribly uncomfortable. And it's really cool that we have this free, think what you want to think, explore. But there's a power that these anti-abortion activists have that the liberal religious people of the world, spiritual people, excuse me, however you want to say, the compassion motivated people of the world don't seem to have yet, which is that they have no problem getting volunteers with megaphones to stand in front of every Planned Parenthood across the nation. They have no challenge with getting people, to bring their AR, whatever, on their back and stand in front of a senator's house and shout really, really loud. And this is something that this bluer side of the street, whether you're blue or purple or green or whatever you might be, is only starting to figure out now. And so you've gotten, because don't go into a philosophy rant, okay? Cool it down, bud. If there's one piece of art that we could steal from zealots, it would be to find our zeal and to be as loud and as noisy and engaged as possible. How do you find your zeal? Well, you got to find your notes. I would propose to you today that you should find out where you are certain. I personally am certain that closing loopholes on gun permits, I have no problem with that. I have no fear that Obama is going to come back and secretly be the president, and then he's going to come and take anybody's guns who's defending our democracy. I have no fear that that's going to happen if you just close the loopholes on gun permits. Right? I can get zealous about that, and I know that in my zeal, I will be aligned with a large percentage of the voting populace of the United States, who is usually fractured and polarized and biting at each other and sniping at each other, and is actually a massive base of power that one could use to make change. So is your zeal that you'll ask everyone you know if they know how to secure their firearms, if they have them? Okay, content warning. I mean, I hope the content warning was known that we'll talk a little bit about school shootings in this sermon. But did you know that the majority of those are not happening from randos who come outside? They're happening from students who got their guns from friends or family. This is because those guns are not locked away in a safe with the ammunition kept separately. If we could just figure out how to get gun enthusiasts to lock up their firearm, you can directly start preventing school shootings and other tragedies like that right now, not to mention suicides. Is that your zeal? If you're a parent, maybe you'll do the awkward move of, before your child goes to someone else's house, texting them and asking, do you have firearms in your house? And if so, are they locked up safely? It's a very small thing. Are you zealous enough to be that awkward? Are you going to do your best to get President Biden to exert some executive authority? What is it? I think it's the Charleston loophole, which is you have to do a background check, but if it's too slow and it takes more than 3 days, you can just sell the person a gun anyway. And usually the reason they're too slow is because you have to weed through the criminal background of the person whose background check is taking that long. So that's something that, to start, you don't need the Senate on board with. You just need the president to to steal one good thing from Donald Trump and just sign an executive order. You can start it there. If we find out where you are certain and where you are zealous, you gain a great power, which is the power to be willing to shout your certainty at anyone with 2 ears who doesn't walk away from you. And this is the only power that those minority opinions have over us when it comes to lawmaking. They're not particularly richer. There is a gun lobby, most of these laws and most of the rhetoric that promotes, these weird colonial attitudes, most of that is from gun manufacturers because there's money to be made by more guns on the street. But they're not wealthier than 85% of the voting populace of the United States, right? There's a big old power differential. And I believe that all that's missing is zeal. I started today's talk with finding refuge because I didn't want to come in and say, okay, I know you're mourning, but here's what you do. Here's my agenda. We're going to do this, we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. To me, that actually feels a little predatory. But if we can get into the present moment, if we can get in our hearts, and if we can get out of freeze, we can find a way to take action. And I'd like to share with you the good news that there is a lot of action to be taken. So the call to action, I'd like you today, I only have 2 options to give you to start with, but you can go on your uua.org and look up UU gun policy, UU gun reform, and see what actions are already recommended. Someone's already doing that work for you. Another great group you might take a look at, you might go right after the service, on the deck, and look up Moms Demand Action. And someone has already compiled a list of all the stuff you can do and all the articles and all the research and all the victories that have already been made in 21 states and the District of Columbia. And it's just a small step to getting similar changes happening in your city, county, state, and federally. You are not without power. You are not without friends, and we are not without tools to keep ourselves out of overwhelm on one hand and numbness on the other. So thank you so much for listening to this talk this morning. I hope it has helped you find resource. I hope it has helped you be mad in a way that is constructive to you and those around you. And I hope that it has helped to kindle that ember of active hope that lives in our hearts.